Hello, I'm Anthony. Today I want to talk to you about the concept of the sunk cost fallacy as it relates to music. It's a very fancy sounding term, but it's actually a very simple concept, and it's something that I certainly, as a musician, fall foul of on an almost daily basis. I've written down for myself a 7-point plan to help me try to avoid some of the pitfalls of the sunk cost fallacy. So what is the sunk cost fallacy? Well, a sunk cost is an incurred cost, something that's already been incurred and which can't be recovered. What we're talking about today is the sunk cost of time when it relates to writing a piece of music. A fallacy is a logical flaw or unsound argument. And the sunk cost fallacy goes something along the lines of, well, I've spent this long doing it, I might as well finish. That is a logical flaw. That's an actually factually incorrect thing to say, because you should only carry on investing more time in an endeavour, in this case writing a piece of music, if it's actually worth doing. And that concept breaks down into lots of little subcomponents as well, and that's what we're going to talk about today. This 7-point plan that I've written to help me try to avoid some of the snares of the sunk cost fallacy. So here they are. Number 1, be at your most critical at the start of the project. Sunk cost is an ever-accumulating cost. The more time you invest in a thing, the more difficult it's going to be to let that thing go. And so the earlier on in the project that you can identify that something's wrong, and this is actually just a fundamentally weak idea, you've got the minimum amount of time invested, so be super critical of yourself right at the very beginning of the project. If you think about it, that also makes complete sense from a practical perspective, because the beginning of your project, if you choose to write a bass line, for instance, at the very beginning, or the rhythm at the very beginning of the piece, those first couple of decisions that you make are the architectural foundation upon which everything else is built. I often view a piece of music as an inverted pyramid. Those blocks down at the bottom of this inverted pyramid are the components upon which everything else rests. And if those initial decisions or those initial ideas are weak, then that's going to have a knock-on effect onto the rest of the piece of music that you're writing. So I think it's absolutely critical to get a really good idea right out of the gate. The benefit of having this hyper-awareness at the beginning of the project and the preparedness to throw it away completely without even going any further is that the beginning of the project is one of the most fun parts, well, certainly for me. With an empty project and all of my plugins and all of the possibilities open to me, that's the most exciting time for me. It's the most fun I have when I'm writing a piece of music. So I'm actually pretty happy to throw something away completely and start again after maybe a couple of hours of investment. The sunk cost is at its lowest. You don't have the emotional burden that's starting to weigh down on you, the sunk cost fallacy, as it's starting to acquire some heft. And you get that sense of being able to pat yourself on the back and say, well done, disaster averted there. I might very easily have spent 50 hours on a project that was just fundamentally weak right at the very outset. And one of the decision branches that I make at this point actually ties into the 7th of the points that I'm going to make today. We'll leave that till we get there. Number 2, consider each part of your project as a spinning plate. Constantly return to it to give it a little spin, because it might very well be that something that started out being good or you thought was good actually turns out to be a bit of a dud. If you think about each track or each part in your piece of music as something that you need to love, you need to absolutely love hearing it in order for the entire thing to work. Well, you might start out the project being in love and fall out of love. That can happen. But if you're not prepared to undergo that re-evaluation on a fairly regular basis and just go back to each individual part and listen to each track in isolation, I'm not saying solo it, I'm saying that as you listen to the thing through, think about it from the perspective of the bass line or the kick drum or the snare or any individual part. Treat each one of them as a candidate for rejection at any time. This ties in with point number 3. It's faster to throw something away and write a new part than it is to fix a broken thing. Have you ever spent that interminable hell, that miserable period of time when you try to fix your bad snare sound and you go through your colossal library of sample sounds, listening to every snare sound in the context of the piece of music as it's cycling round? You very quickly lose the will to live. It's such a miserable thing to do. It's probably the worst time I have when I'm writing a song, when I'm trying to forensically replace one sound for another. It almost never works because the inspiration that led to that piece in the first place is gone. It's completely gone. Trying to impose a new sound over the template of that old sound is just an incredibly difficult thing to do, but it's really tempting. You listen to the snare and you think, oh, you know what, I've gone off that snare. I need something a bit duller or fatter or thinner or sharper. How hard can it be? I'll dip into my sample library and I'll find something in no time. That's very rarely the case. What actually happens is that you end up half an hour later, just pressing the down arrow on your keyboard, going through sample after sample, auditioning them in place, and it's just utterly miserable. You lose all perspective, you lose the ability to really hear what you're doing, and you end up in this kind of blank fog, which is completely pointless and drains all of the joy of the songwriting process away from you. If you just press delete and throw that snare sound away, and you've got a big hole in the song, that's a problem. But it's also an opportunity for you to come up with something brand new, have a new idea, get a new sound in, be inspired by that sound to come up with a replacement. And if you can't, then you might need to step up the rejection scissors at a higher level and say, well, do I need to throw this entire project away? Has it actually fundamentally failed? Now, if you're talking about something as fundamental as one of your core sounds, we'll stick with the example of the snare, you need to make that decision pretty early on. You don't want to get 50 hours into the songwriting process before you decide that you don't like the sound of the snare. And this is what I'm talking about, the re-evaluation process. Constantly being prepared to listen to each individual element in turn and say, are you still pulling your weight? Do you still sound good? Sometimes a thing that started out sounding good ends up sounding bad because of other parts that have come over the top. And now you've got a brand new decision to make. Do you throw the new parts away and get back to what you knew was good? Or is the new stuff actually superior, in which case you need to backtrack a little bit? All of that is fine. All of those decisions are perfectly fine to make, and I'm not saying you need to throw the entire song away. I'm just saying be aware that that's the kind of decision branching that you're going to need to do in order to protect yourself against actually writing a bad piece of music. That's what you absolutely don't want to end up doing. Number 4, don't confuse being in the moment with actually writing something that's any good. Because when you're in the moment, when you come up with that brand new part, it almost always sounds amazing. You think you're just an absolute genius. You come back the following day and wonder what you were thinking. Well, having the ability to separate those two things is critically important. These days, I try to do my songwriting in chunks of no more than 20 minutes at a time, because the last thing that you want to do is come up with an idea that's going to turn out to be bad, but you think is good at the moment, and then you put another idea on top of it. You use that bad idea as a foundation upon which to layer something new, because when you pull that foundation away, everything above it is going to collapse. So don't allow your sunk cost to snowball. I call this the sunk cost accumulator. You put the bad apple at the bottom of the barrel, and then you just tip a load of good apples on top of it. Well, guess what's going to happen? They're all going to turn rotten. Number 5, and this is something that's very personal to me, so you can kind of choose to cut this one out if you want. If you're writing a song and it has lyrics, write as much of the song as you possibly can as far as the music's concerned, including the melody that's going to be sung before writing your lyrics. Now, like I say, this is very personal to me, but I have enormous difficulty writing lyrics. I find it more difficult than all of the other parts of the song together. It generally takes me about half of the total amount of time that I spend writing a song on composing the lyrics. The last thing that you want to do is write lyrics for a part that's going to get replaced or changed, because now your syllable structure's wrong. Everything's going to need to be reworked, and those lyrics that you've sweated blood and tears over are no longer going to be appropriate. So I like to make sure that every other component of my song is absolutely pristine and exactly how I want it to be. How many verses are there? Are there choruses? If so, how many? How do all of the parts fit together? Do I need vocal segues? All of those decisions need to be made beforehand before I start writing the lyrics. And obviously it goes without saying, don't write lyrics for a bad song. If I'm going to spend 50 hours writing lyrics for a song, I want to make sure that the tune is actually good and I'm really pleased with the vocal melody before going to all of that effort to put the words down on a piece of paper. Any patrons or channel members of mine will know that whenever I publish a song, I always release the handwritten notes for the lyrics, and sometimes they span 15, 20 pages of revisions. It's a very tortuous process, and I want to leave it right till the very end to make absolutely sure that that's a worthwhile investment of time. In other words, I'm minimizing my sunk cost. Now, number 6 is actually an argument in favour of pursuing the sunk cost, but you just obviously need to be aware that the fallacy is always bad. This principle is that there is value in completing a project. You can't abandon every project because it's not good enough on the basis of sunk cost fallacy, because if you never finish a piece of music, you're not going to acquire the experience that you need in order to be able to finish a piece of music. There are processes that you undergo at the very end of the piece, particularly mixing and mastering, the final production, that you're not going to get to until you've put all of the other parts in place. It's also a really important gate to go through to actually have a finished, published piece of music, to be able to go back and listen to it and say, I finished that, I did it. Obviously, you want it to be as high quality as possible, but there is an argument to say sometimes you actually just do need to get through the gate. I was 49 years old before I published my first piece of music. It was actually the original reason why I started this channel, because I'd fallen the other side of the sunk cost fallacy. I'd basically said, I'm so aware that I'm wasting my time here that I'm not going to waste any more time. And I made that decision every time I wrote a piece of music. And I ended up kind of resting on it as a crutch. You need to identify that there is a danger there, but you also need to be determined enough to actually get the thing finished. Those two principles are in direct conflict with each other. And so point number 6 is probably the most dangerous of them all, because it's actively encouraging the sunk cost fallacy. This in itself is a skill, to identify the fact that, you know what, this piece of music is good enough to finish, and I'm relying on this fallacy argument to convince me that I'm allowed to stop. I'm not going to listen to that inner voice kind of inciting me to quit. I am going to get the thing finished, and I'm going to trust that in this case that my judgment is good enough and this piece of music is actually good enough to release. The tension behind those two opposite forces is tricky to navigate, but at least if you're aware of it, then you can identify potentially when you're tending towards just laziness, relying on the concept of sunk cost fallacy to kind of entitle you to stop the music, to stop writing the piece, versus having that determination to actually push through to a finished product, which is hugely psychologically important and will encourage you to pick up your pen again in the future and start writing a new piece. Finally, point number 7 ties all the way back to point number 1. And in fact, most of the other points. If at any stage you decide to abandon the project because it's not good enough, all is not lost. You don't have to throw your entire investment away. I have an area called the sandpit. In my project folder, I have a folder called sandpit. And if a project doesn't work, that piece of music typically ends up in the sandpit. I use the projects in that folder as jam or practice sessions. And what I'll typically do is I'll identify the key of the song and I'll name that project. If it might have had a name at that point, I might have actually given it a song title. I'll basically strip it of that song title and I'll give it the name of the key that it's in. So I might have a project called C# minor, and I know that if I load that thing, I can jam over the top of it in C# minor on the guitar or the keyboard or whatever. And I can actually get some pleasure out of that piece of music that I've written. Sure, it's not going to be a finished published piece, and that's a shame, but you know what, it didn't cut it. I still get to enjoy playing over the top of it, and it's a damn sight better than jamming over a click track or some very bare, boring rhythm. Consigning projects to the sandpit has another benefit as well. It means if in the future you ever come back to that project and think, you know what, there's a gem in there somewhere, I can throw X, Y, Z away, and A, B, and C are really good, then you can reinvigorate it. There's absolutely no reason to abandon that project permanently. It's basically just sat on the bench. I find it really helpful psychologically to never actually delete any music. I very, very rarely delete anything that goes beyond a simple bass line and drum line. Once I'm more than an hour into a project, I pretty much won't delete it. I'll put it in the sandpit and then I'm going to get some psychological value out of it, if nothing else. So that's my 7-point plan to avoid sunk cost fallacy. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I have Patreon and channel member links for those who would like to support my channel so that I can carry on making these videos. See you later. Thanks very much.